Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and today we're going to talk about the role that architecture can and must play in delivering better design outcomes from our infrastructure investment. It's a subject we've discussed before on the podcast, notably with architect Harbinder Birdi, who is currently leading work with the Institution of Civil Engineers to promote and in many ways rebirth the role of design champions as central figures in the delivery of major infrastructure projects. It's a role that was set out in the 2020 National Infrastructure Strategy and reinforced by the National Infrastructure Commission, which said board-level design champions were crucial to gaining better outcomes from our public investment. And without doubt, it's a subject which is gaining traction. I mean, in short, good design matters, and with huge pressure to turn limited funds into better economic, social and environmental outcomes, every infrastructure professional must now do more than simply play lip service to the notion that good design matters. It has to be the fundamental driver behind every investment decision and linked implicitly to creating those vital, better social, economic and environmental outcomes. So let's find out what it's really like at the sharp end. My guest today is Clare Donnelly, Director at Architecture Practice Faraday Pollard, and notably the architect driving better design on major infrastructure programmes such as the Tideway project and the Lower Thames Crossing. Clare is also a member of the National Infrastructure Commission Design Group, so I think we'll be very well placed to shed some light on what's going right in our approach to design and, of course, where it could be better. So Clare, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Well, let's get straight into the role of championing good design, Clare. I mean, it's a phrase that you use to define what you do. Certainly, it's plastered all over your LinkedIn anyway. From an infrastructure perspective, what is it?
I always talk about infrastructure projects. Now, the project environment has been a fairly gladiatorial arena. They're very large, complex teams. Everyone has their own perspective to put forward. And for me, being passionate about good design, about, creative design that responds well to the needs of people and places and the environment, it's about championing that agenda within the large project environment and trying to get the best outcomes. So focusing on that end user, right, and hopefully making sure that their voice is heard throughout all of the processes, the procedures you have to go through to get a big infrastructure project across the line.
Well, I describe this conversation as being about the role that architecture can and must play, but of course it's also about the role that engineering must play in designing better outcomes from our infrastructure investment. And I suppose, having worked at the sharp end, as I said, of infrastructure delivery, and as a member of the National Infrastructure Commission Design Group, how do you make that vital link up? How does an architect champion infrastructure design?
Well, I think for me, architects and engineers have really a complementary set of skills. If you set yourselves in opposition to each other, you're not going to achieve anything. So for us, it's trying to understand what the practical constraints are around the engineering, what we have to deliver, what the core purpose of it is. And then as the architect, it's trying to work out what else it can do. How can it respond to the place that it's in? How could we maximize additional benefits? How can we use those design tools and then feed them into and talk to and really lean on that really technical expertise we get through from the engineering team? So championing good design has to be a collaborative effort. It has to be a multidisciplinary effort. You can't come in as an architect and be the big, the star-architect idea and try and impose your ideas on people. It's a real exercise in listening, understanding, negotiation and respect, I think, across all of the disciplines.
Well, it's interesting you just say that, because I use the phrase rebirth the role of design champions as central figures in delivery of major infrastructure projects, because it feels like our Victorian forebears, and arguably even more contemporary, such as Sir Owen Williams, with his M1 and Wembley Stadium designs, they did seem to grasp this notion that engineering is great, but it has to really integrate with what it looks like and what it delivers for the user. I mean, would you agree that we've perhaps lost our way when it comes to bringing those two disciplines together?
I mean, the high watermark, and no pun intended, is Bazalgette, I think, in how incredibly joined up the Victorian sewage system was, providing parks, providing mooring points. It's absolutely extraordinary. I think really exemplary examples of good design exist in infrastructure projects, but it can be quite ad hoc and dependent on the personalities of the people who are involved. So I think there's definite scope there to try and improve and raise the bar generally, and not just on the big, splashy, iconic schemes, on the sort of everyday infrastructure that really affects the lives of communities. So it doesn't always have to be the amazing Crossrail stations, for example, that have been developed. They get a lot of attention. It can also be about how you integrate telecommunications infrastructure in our streets and across our cities.
Yeah, I mentioned the Owen Williams because I drove under one of his M1 bridges at the weekend, and it just reminded me that they are iconic, and they are, they're not to everyone's taste, but they are very, very recognisable in terms of the way that they're designed. And
they're a fantastic example of designing infrastructure with a sort of sense of pride.
Right.
There's thought that's gone into them. I mean, we were looking at them the other day as a precedent for Lower Thames Crossing.
Right.
And some people like them, some people hate them, but there's a definite thought and care that has gone into them, and they demonstrate a national pride in our significant infrastructure, which has a civic purpose and deserves that kind of care, attention.
Yeah. And there was a lot of modularity in them, of course, because I mean, the focus on outcomes is now considered crucial on infrastructure projects. You mentioned projects like Crossrail, and you talked about Tideway, obviously, that you're involved in. But there is so much scrutiny now on cost and public value for money. Is it still possible to champion what matters most to the public?
I think, yes, I do. I think it is possible. But what it requires is really from the very earliest stages of a design project that you have people who are focused on those outcomes, because when it gets expensive is when it's retrofitted, when you fix solutions and you're having to bolt additional benefits on. So you need to focus on those outcomes from the very outset, and then monitor yourself and deliver against those as you go through the whole project life cycle.
I mean, we're going to see the big reveal, of course, of the work you've been doing in the footsteps of Bazalgette, of course, down on Tideway. Why is Tideway, in your view, a better project as a result of your design championing? What exactly did you do on the project? What does a champion of good design do all day on a project like that?
So, I mean, I spoke a little bit about it at the beginning, and I also want to say Tideway is an extraordinary project for a really respectful and understanding culture that it's got there. So all of the people who are working on it are very good at pulling towards an end user, and we're all very passionate about reconnecting London with River Thames, which was our vision statement. Yeah. And so we, for us, we were pushing out an open door. We had a very collaborative process. We worked with the engineers and the environment disciplines in particular, planning, land and property, at the beginning to try and set out what good design looks like for that, to achieve that vision. And we wrote a set of design principles for the DCO. We worked through different ideas, how much standardization, how much specificity should there be in the design proposal at each site, and tried to set that direction and then translate that through to something that future people working on the project, because hundreds of thousands of people have worked on that project. So how do you get that, the very popular phrase, the golden thread, to run through from those early conversations that you're having with stakeholders, public, and make sure that translates through in the design at the end of the day. And that's been our role. A lot of it was design up front, but then ensuring that continuity and communicating that broadly across all the people involved.
Yeah, because I get the impression, well, I imagine that it probably wasn't that easy at the start, because you're dealing with a team which is trying to create, a bit of civil engineering.
It actually, because the sites were so sensitive, you've got sites opposite the London Eye, on a listed piece of river wall, in the setting of a World Heritage Site, there was an understanding that we were going to have to work a bit harder. And so we were welcomed in. And I think the other thing that Tideway did, and it was obviously a pre-COVID era, but we sat co-located with the rest of the design disciplines for 5 years. We were there. Next to me was the engineer, opposite was the environment consultant. I mean, we were having debates all the time about how to balance and meet the needs of the various disciplines working on this. So it was not a sort of hostile and challenging environment. Occasional pockets of that, there's a huge skepticism, I think, about architects in that situation.
But what you're saying, it was more than just lending them your coloured pencils.
I hope so. Yes, they might say differently, but I hope so.
The NRC Design Group has just launched some new guidance on developing project-level design principles aimed at project directors, but it also touches on the role of design champions and builds on the design principles for national infrastructure. I mean, that presumably really wraps in some of the lessons that you've gained from projects like Tideway. I mean, how do you see the guidance helping to boost the outcomes from our infrastructure investment?
So it really is what we spoke about, that focus on outcomes right from the very beginning. And the need for leadership, you always need leaders on these projects to champion and convene and bring people together across the project and across all of the disciplines, whether they be design related or not. It's really about trying to formalise some of those things that we learned on Tideway and then subsequently on Lower Thames Crossing, and be helpful essentially to project directors.
Yeah.
The idea is it forms a framework, we're calling it a handbook, to help them understand where and when in the process they should be starting to have design conversations. Hopefully it will help in the appointment and the briefing of particular designers. And it builds, as we say, on that guidance we wrote for the design principles back in 2020, which is remaining quite relevant. You know, there has been a lot of buy-in from the industry for climate, people, place and value as the key sort of linchpins for how we should develop design proposals.
Because what you're effectively saying is it's not an add-on that comes later. It has to be fundamental at the start of the project inception. I suppose, why is that so difficult?
Well, I mean, nationally significant infrastructure projects are vast and complicated things, and you can't underestimate the scale. I mean, there's just hundreds and hundreds of people, and they've all got slightly different perspectives on how you want to deliver. So the idea about having a vision statement up front and then allowing that to flow through into design principles sort of just aligns all those sort of different arrows on the map and just gets everyone pulling in the same direction.
Yeah.
And the reason we've written this guidance is because it's difficult. It's not easy. And, you know, project directors and people who are running it are saying, well, we hear what you're saying in the infrastructure design group, but how can we deliver that?
Yeah.
So it's supposed to be really practical advice, you know, and it's tweaks to processes basically. But I think leadership is really important and really stating the outcomes that you want from the start. I'm going to sound like a real cracked record in this podcast because those are the key takeaways for us, that you have to start thinking, use the creativity of your design team to define and explore those outcomes and then write down what it is you want, really capture that all the way through the process.
Because of course the outcomes from investment in infrastructure stretch beyond simply generating those economic returns, although those economic returns are really, really important. So how does the guidance help to really place climate and people and place and, value at their heart?
I think it's about having really honest discussions early on about what you can and can't achieve with the project. Mm-hmm. And when you have to write it down, when you have to commit, you commit it to paper, you have to have those conversations much earlier. We don't want to see wasted time. We want to see really slick consent processes as well. So if you can have those conversations early on, it can really reduce your consenting risks. And if you've been through major infrastructure projects, you know that is one of the main areas that you lose time is trying to get through all your regulatory approvals up front. So it's about trying to have quite a broad conversation, I think, which we call like the divergent thinking, and then having the convergent thinking. So you think about all of the options and the things you could do, and then really narrow in on the ones that will add value and can be delivered as part of your scheme, instead of going with what I call like a Christmas tree approach, where you come up with the core infrastructure and then people just hang things on it, and it can end up becoming unwieldy and expensive. So you need to be focused and efficient. Yeah,
and really expensive, but also not actually achieving the objectives that you set out to achieve from a design perspective. Yeah. Talk a bit about you, Claire, for a moment, because you're an architect who's involved quite a lot of your working day in major infrastructure projects. What got you first interested in design and building stuff?
Well, I mean, I'm from I'm a builder's background, so all my family are carpenters and builders, and I think I was always just fascinated.
And that's a good thing.
Yes, exactly. I mean, and I was always just fascinated by it. And To be honest as well, I was looking for a career that could exercise every part of my brain, from the artistic to the technical, the social and the humanities. So architecture is a perfect degree for that to study. And when I was doing my degree, I mean, I think that's when I started to get interested in infrastructure. We were taken down to the embankment, for example.
Right, yeah.
Which in hindsight is,
You've never left.
I don't know. It's sort of weird. And shown what the impact of these big projects are and how civically important they are. So that, yeah, I think it's been ingrained from the start. The fact that I'd like the built environment and how it makes a difference to the lives of people, I think is what drives me.
Because infrastructure, when it comes to architecture, it's not for everybody. A lot of architects, they would prefer to be involved in those glamorous, shiny commercial buildings. Not for you, though.
Well, I'm gonna reject the premise of that question. So we can do big and shiny and glamorous buildings. Our station at Abbey Wood has just won a Riva London Award. I would consider it to be a really important building for the people who live and work around that in that community. And hopefully it's made their lives easier and better. And that's the point. It's very easy for me to work in infrastructure because I feel that it can make a civic difference. I've worked on shiny, lovely houses for very rich clients, and you don't have that impact for people. Yeah. So I find it, I suppose, more socially fulfilling. Yeah.
Well, you've been at Faraday Pollard for over 20 years and director of major infrastructure for the last 12. I mean, historically, there is something of a cultural divide between architects and engineers. I mean, I don't know. Discuss. Do you think that cultural divide still exists in terms of their approach to design?
I think we're trained in quite different ways. I think there is. We architects have a very strange training. I don't know if you know a lot about it, but we are absolutely trained to understand that you're the lead consultant on a project for a building, and that you have to sort of understand all of the disciplines below you and try and convene. And it's an adjustment when you're an architect that moves on to an infrastructure project. You're not the lead consultant. Right, yeah. And you're bringing that expertise, but you're used to working collaboratively. And I think that's the important thing you get from an architectural education. You're used to having to get planning, and you're used to talking to the end user. So you're given a really broad education. Now, anything I'm going to say about engineering education is going to be anecdotal and based on the conversations I've had with my colleagues. But I mean, I've been told that there's already a huge amount that's packed into an engineering education. It's very technically focused, and there's a real stress around being able to deliver on that technical side of things. And it's already so hard to pack all of that into a degree course and the professional qualifications that it's quite hard to sort of pull back and go and try and think about the broader issues with sort of society and culture and art and all those other things that you might bring into that. So I think that's why I say we have different and complementary skills. There is not a single thing we could have delivered on Tideway or Lower Thames Crossing that could not have been done without engineers. Yeah. That's just it. Yeah, but
you studied at Cambridge University, of course, where arguably the divide between architecture and engineering is deliberately narrowed. I mean, how would you say that that education at Cambridge helped you to become a better designer, a more collaborative designer?
So I did, and I think we had amazing lectures at Cambridge, which at least gives you the confidence that you've got a really safe foundation to start having some of those interdisciplinary conversations. Though I have to say Cambridge's focus on that interdisciplinary collaboration is a little bit, there's more of it now than there was when I was there.
Oh, right. That's interesting.
20 odd years ago. But I also studied at Sheffield, and Sheffield is one of the few universities that has dual courses. So there's an architecture and landscape discipline, there's an architecture and engineering course. So we were used to having engineers come into the studio when we were learning, and landscape architects coming into the studio, and there would be combined projects. And also what was interesting about Sheffield was they had a big focus when they had Jeremy Till, who was head of the school there, on the political and understanding the political context of design, and also a big focus on community consultation and how that could affect design. So that Cambridge and Sheffield together I think, sort of got the whole spectrum of the skills we would need.
And of course, those last two elements are so fundamental to actually getting things done, actually embracing the politics, embracing the community needs, and arguably something which isn't done well enough.
Yeah, it's always challenging consultation, because first of all, you have to be very clear about the questions that you're putting out there and have materials that are going to be completely understandable for the layman. And then on the flip side, it's reinterpreting those comments that come back in. But I've never had a project that got worse, for having had that engagement. And it's really a really important part of the process, and often adds real value to the designs that you ultimately build.
Well, let's build on that a bit. Talk about creating infrastructure fit for the future. I mean, you've been helping to develop the design champion role at the IC. I know you've been talking to Harbinder on that whole process. I mean, how do you see the challenges there, and what are the opportunities of this design champion role?
So, I mean, I've always been very clear in my mind that the design champion should be from an engineering background on these big civil engineering projects, ideally. And I've known several in my career who would be really good at it, but they've come at it without any kind of formal training or support. And so while we've got examples like Nick Sirota, the people who've acted as design champions on projects, we need to help define what exactly the role is, and what their responsibilities are throughout the process. And that's what the work that Harbinder has been doing. So we've been in the design group, we've been supporting Harbinder, we've been talking to him about examples of what's worked well and what hasn't worked so well, and the kind of infrastructure that a design champion would need about them to make it work. Does
that mean that the learnings from your work on, say, the Tideway project or the Lower Thames Crossing, about the role of design champion, did it underline the fact that while you can do a certain amount, you're not necessarily the right person for that then, as an architect?
This is an interesting debate, I think, because we had a debate about what the person's spec should be, and I do feel that in that situation, usually the lead designer is going to be an engineer, and the design champion would probably feel more confident in directing that person if they are an engineer themselves. I think there is a role for architects within that space. And so my role on Tideway, I am what they call the legacy design advisor, and I advise the design champion on the sort of legacy, the above ground aspect. So I don't get involved in tunnelling. I can't specify concrete, but we can talk about public realm. We can talk about the interfaces with the above ground structures. We can talk about planning consents, all of those issues. And similarly on Lower Thames Crossing, my job there is on this aspect, so those broader benefits, to advise how the design could come together to better integrate that road in its environment. And when we have a challenge, like, for example, excavating material we needed to get rid of, how it could be creatively employed on that project so that we can leave a benefit and a legacy in the future. But I am not a highways designer, and the core purpose of that project is to relieve the Dartford crossing and provide a road crossing across the Thames.
So something best suited to somebody who knows about highways design. Does good design cost more?
I think I go back to my earlier point. Yes, if you try and retrofit it at the end, but no, if you do it up front, you decide what you want, you put things in the right place, you make them the right scale, you've done 90% of the design, without having to attach cladding or dress the civil engineering in a particular way. It's about trying to make the engineering itself as well designed as possible.
Right. One of the things which is increasingly ubiquitous is digital technology, and it's used increasingly in the design and delivery of infrastructure. Do you think that makes for better design, or do you think it makes it less likely that designs are going to be good?
I think it leads to better coordination. I think it's a tool that we can use, but it won't necessarily get you good design. You could have the best coordinated bad design possible that achieves no multiple benefits, but you can also use it in other respects. I think the really exciting thing for me when I'm working in the digital space is also being able to use those models to allow people to look around, to try and understand the full impact of the infrastructure projects, which are at such scale that they're sometimes quite difficult to communicate. So it's a really powerful tool, but it won't do the job for you unless you are critical and thoughtful about the information that you're putting into it.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing to bear in mind, I suppose, also when you're involved in design is that things change. We're now prioritising net zero and biodiversity gain in the ways that we've never imagined a decade ago. I mean, how should the design process therefore change in response to that inevitable change that's going to come along?
It's really interesting. We're currently working on a project. You've just got to have where you have to have more of those disciplines coming in up front and talking to you about the opportunities that could be involved. So we're trying to engage ecologists really early in the design process, because we know that we have to achieve biodiversity net gain. We can't wait for all the surveys to come back. We have to think about how it could be woven into the design of that project right from the start. And it's just about, I think it's about having a generosity. We have to work really hard now with our infrastructure projects. I mean, we've got carbon, we've got biodiversity, there's social value, all of these things all the way up front. So you need to start with quite a generous approach to the process. And I think this is where principles come in, because you try and define what it is you're trying to achieve in respect for each one of those different disciplines as early as you can.
Yeah.
And we're just going to have to be more collaborative more early in the design process, I think, to meet those challenges.
Which I suppose is why actually, having all that thought process really embedded in the training and really embedded in the whole process of every project makes that more inevitable that's going to happen. And we've been talking, Claire, about architecture for better infrastructure. So, with all these new, hopefully bright young things coming into the profession, what's your advice to these new infrastructure professionals keen to champion good design and demonstrate that it's worth investing time and money to drive better outcomes? What's your advice to them to actually make that happen?
I mean, it's really tough. I think it's about trying to read broadly and understand the context that you're going into. Your CPD has never been more important. We are getting changes in regulation all the time. We're moving from a sort of impacts-led design to an opportunities and environmental mitigation process. So things are changing all the time. So you have to keep on top of those changes. And it's really about trying to understand the broader impacts of your project on the society and the natural environment. And if you can do that, if you can listen to your technical experts, try and be honest and build trust with them and your stakeholders, I think creative problem solving as part of that design process can really contribute to a really high quality outcome. So, be Renaissance man and do everything, that's the plan.
But there must also be a role for being a specialist in an area.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when I started on Tideway, I sort of went in and I was just like, this is the Rolls Royce of design teams. You'd have not only ecologists, you'd have aquatic ecologists you'd be able to talk to about the surfacing of your river wall design. How could we improve biodiversity on that? So when you work on these infrastructure projects, you meet the most amazing experts who have these incredible niches, and you can learn from them. You talk to them, learn from them, and get their contributions into the proposals. And that's what I mean about a generosity and a communication. It's listening and understanding how you can all contribute to those end goals.
So just to finish off with then, Claire, what's your killer pitch to persuade every client to invest in good design?
Okay. I think good design will save you money and reduce your consenting risk. Those are usually two very high priority elements for people. But I think it would also make you and your grandchildren really proud when you visit again in 30 years' time and you leave that really amazing positive legacy for society.
Brilliant. Well, we look forward to seeing the results of that when the hoardings all come down on Tideway. When do your bits of good designs really go on show to the public on Tideway?
So they have started. We have connected up the tunnel. We've had one open in Putney for several months now, but Chelsea, and they're going to go west. So you're going to see them a lot, I think, a lot of us throughout 24 and 25 now.
Well, yeah, that will be very, very, very good, and certainly a huge milestone for the capital, and maybe we'll go swimming in the Thames again very soon.
No, don't. It's a very dangerous environment. Don't go swimming in it.
Okay, fine. Claire, thanks so much for joining me today on the Infrastructure Podcast. It's been fascinating to hear your thoughts on good design. Thanks for sharing them.
Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. That's all we've got time for today, but we've got more for the Infrastructure Podcast in the pipeline and more guests to talk to as we continue to probe the big issues faced across the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website, www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you will find background information and all the latest podcasts to listen to and to share. So thanks for joining us. So thanks again to Claire. I look forward to seeing you again very soon.